Greetings, Internet! Here I am with another video essay, and no points for guessing what it's about if you read the thumbnail. Now, let me start off by saying that the reason I decided to do this video essay is not because I'm intending to make these Disney direct-to-video sequel essays a thing here on my channel. As I mentioned in my previous video essay on The Hunchback of Notre Dame 2, I decided to give the whole Disney cheapquel spiel a rest after years of being on board the hate bandwagon in the earlier days of the internet. But I do feel that disembarking the hate train doesn't mean that one shouldn't be allowed to talk about them at all, so long as they're going in with an open mind because they have something to say, and not just to add to the pile of hate that everyone else has. Pocahontas 2 is one that I want to talk about, but not for the reasons you're probably expecting, or probably even hoping for if you really are into the hate for it. The reason I am talking about it is because I've seen all sorts of commotion online for decades about this one often being one of Disney's most reviled sequels. Before Mulan 2 became the most popular one to hate in light of Doug Walker's 2016 Disney-cember, I remember going through the comment section of many internet videos where people would be really emphatic about their hatred for the cheapquels, and Pocahontas 2, Journey to a New World, would be among the ones that people would go straight after like a pack of wolves. Even WatchMojo.com did a list of worst animated movies where they put Pocahontas 2 on, even though the movie didn't make the top of their list for worst Disney sequels of all time, apparently as a way of pandering to their audience. Not that I ever took WatchMojo very seriously anyways. So I wanted to give my 2 cents on the movie and try to look at it as objectively as possible, without the taint of popular consensus. And I've decided that this time, like I did with my video essay on Hunchback 2, this one will be clipless as well. So hopefully you can enjoy listening to it while you're washing the dishes or working on another project or whatever. But before I get into the sequel, I do first want to give a more than brief overview of my thoughts on the first Pocahontas. So if you want to cut to the quick and get to the sequel, I'll include this timestamp right here. Pocahontas, honestly, is among my least favorite entries in the Disney canon. Certainly not to say that I hate it. Chicken Little is the only one in their canon that I've seen that I legitimately do hate. That's really just more a testament to how great their films have been overall. I did own the movie on VHS when I was a kid. I've watched it several times. I know all the songs and could quote just about any scene from it, but nowadays, maybe I've just been watching too much Lindsay Ellis, but my perception of the movie has become a lot more critical over the years. I will say that the movie does make for a very interesting case study. If you know your Disney Renaissance history, you'll know that Disney referred to Pocahontas as their A project and Lion King as their B project, expecting that the latter would be the launching pad for the former to become their ultimate crowning achievement. And we all know what the outcome of that one was. So I think the big lesson from that is that it's really just through the right combination of talent and luck that a work of art can be hailed as both a masterpiece and a runaway hit, with people praising it as the greatest thing ever for generations to come. So don't count your chickens before they hatch. Now, full disclosure, I don't think one could ever realistically expect a historically accurate Pocahontas in the first place, a big reason being that it would involve her going around as a mascot for tobacco products. Yes, that would technically mean that Pocahontas would be the one Disney princess that might get kids to think that smoking is cool. I'll leave you to make your own South Park Family Guy style jokes about that. But even putting all the Disneyfication aside, Hollywood has a long history of making romanticized depictions of true figures and events, and winning a bunch of awards in the process. It's a practice that has been frequently in question regarding the ethics of, and that's always been met with some form of backlash from groups of people who are offended by such depictions, be they descendants or even survivors in some instances. In the case of Pocahontas, the filmmakers decided to romanticize/flat-out fabricate the bulk majority of the story, only keeping one major detail of the legend intact, that being that Pocahontas saved John Smith from being executed. This interpretation of the story set out to be a combination of the War Between Worlds and the Romeo and Juliet-esque romance that brings the skirmish to a halt and saves the new land. Pocahontas was a real tightrope walk of a film that aimed to hit so many beats at once, departing from the venues that Disney was typically well known for, i.e. not being a fairy tale fantasy setting, not having talking animals, etc., while still including some of that family-friendly stuff that's part of their identity that their established audience was already familiar with, and that they can make loads of merchandise off of to boost the revenue, and having a more serious tone to appeal to award shows, as it was Jeffrey Katzenberg's goal ever since Beauty and the Beast became the first animated feature to get a Best Picture Oscar nomination, for Pocahontas to secure that win before Michael Eisner showed him the door during the film's production. As a side note, there were intentions to have talking animals in Pocahontas, and to have there be a turkey called Red Feather, if I'm recalling correctly, voiced by John Candy, but that idea got nixed after Candy's passing Although in a big twist of irony, Mel Gibson would go on to play a rooster in DreamWorks' Aardman's Chicken Run just a few years later. I do applaud Disney for going in a different direction than what they're used to, and everything they did to up their game in so many departments as they tried to step out of their comfort zones and expand their horizons. But what the film ended up being was both maybe a little too ambitious, a departure from what audiences were used to, and yet at the same time, not quite ambitious enough. And regarding that whole detail about Katzenberg wanting this movie to be that ultimate Best Picture winner, this movie does feel very award-baity in some instances. Story-wise, the romance culture war plot has been a popular subject for critically acclaimed films all the way back to at least the days of Zulu, and as many critics have pointed out, was even perfected in Hayao Miyazaki's masterpiece Princess Mononoke, which has been deemed the plot of Pocahontas, Avatar, Ferngully, Dances with Wolves, done as right as possible. Not too preachy or heavy-handed with the message, doesn't directly vilify any one side, and has a good runtime that gives the right amount of development for all sides. This movie puts so much emphasis on the blossoming romance between Pocahontas and John Smith that it basically leaves little room for them to develop as their own individual characters. Pocahontas' character is defined as a free spirit who is fully in touch with nature and is searching for her own path to ultimately confront the life-changing events that will happen to her in the wake of the settlement, and she likes to goof around with her friends from time to time, but she doesn't exactly have much in the way of personality, I would say. While John Smith is best described as the kind of figure that the real John Smith would build himself up to be in every story that he tells. And with it being a Romeo and Juliet style love story, it matters more in the scheme of the story and how it saves the land of Virginia from the culture clash rather than a romance in its own right, I would say. And then there's the abundance of dramatic poses to make so many of the scenes seem so important. Maybe you've seen some film fans who are critical of Zack Snyder's Justice League films bring up how so many shots in the films are filled with the characters posing heroically more than actually engaging in heroic actions, indicating that Snyder puts more emphasis on the moments instead of the whole story. I feel that Pocahontas does the same thing, in a way. It tries to be so important, but it really puts more emphasis on the moments, some of which don't exactly transition smoothly into one another between the more serious moments and the goofy side character moments. Yes, Hunchback was criticized for this as well, and the comedy moments there are more out of place, but I personally feel those moments are often more select scenes that can be watched in isolation from the rest of the movie. But of course, as I've maintained as a philosophy, audience participation does play a factor. Just because a movie was made to be one thing doesn't mean it can't rise above and beyond and emerge as something else in the eyes of the consumers. And Pocahontas is, of course, a film that is beloved by many people who grew up with it, and has given us a princess who has remained a beloved member of the princess lineup to this day. For my money, though, the only truly remarkable things about Pocahontas are the boldness of its animation and art style, and its memorable score by Alan Menken and Stephen Schwartz. And ironically, the score helped save Schwartz's career after it was waning in the stage department, so I'm grateful to the film for that. Pocahontas 2: A Journey to a New World is less interesting to be sure, but for the longest time, hot take as this might be, I never thought that it was quite the dumpster fire that the rest of the internet made it out to be. But renting the film from my library and rewatching it years later, yeah, there are points where I can concede why it was critically regarded as one of their worst. But most of them are not rooted in the same source of spite I've often seen fired at the movie. However, I want to make it inescapably clear that I'm remaining firm in my belief that however much or little I love a Disney animated classic, that is not going to be a key factor in deciding how I feel about a sequel. I'm evaluating this movie entirely on its own merits and saving favorable or unfavorable comparisons only for where it's absolutely needed. The fact that I don't love Pocahontas is not going to be the reason I'm willing to be one of the few people on the internet to give the sequel a fair shake. Because I assure you there are still plenty of things in the sequel that I can pick apart, even when being as objective about my analysis as I can be. I'll start off with two ways that Pocahontas suffers in similar manners to Hunchback 2. One is that the animation is not up to snuff. Now, to be clear, I don't mean that, because it's direct-to-video, it's an automatic failure. At first glance, you can see it has enough of a budget that gives it a bit more extra polish than something that looks like a Saturday morning TV show from the 90s. The problem is that the budget just isn't enough to mask some of the inherent problems with the animation that crop up, most notably with trying to translate the animation and characters. When watching this movie, it becomes clear that these characters generally weren't meant for a smaller budget or less experienced animators. and at times it's more jarring than other cases I've seen with some other direct-to-video sequels. You can really recognize and appreciate just how much meticulous care and attention was given to designing Pocahontas herself, with a more realistic and down-to-earth anatomy and sense of movement, when you see parts of the sequel where she looks noticeably off-model, specifically her face, and her movements can at times range from feeling relatively restricted to having to break the mold and get more cartoony for the results that the animators wanted. So one thing I can give this movie credit for in regards to making me appreciate the original more is how ambitious the original was with the different direction they went in the animation, and how much it speaks about the etiquette and professionalism of the feature-length animators. The other similarity this movie shares with Hunchback 2 is that it's apparently some sort of apology for its predecessor, and this particularly is what gets people bitching and raving about it. Because the majority of complaints I've seen about the movie just basically boil down to, she didn't get with John Smith at the end. Grrr, hiss, boo freaking who. The big thing with Pocahontas 2 is that it's apparently made in response to all the complaints about the historical inaccuracies. Like it's basically an apology for tampering with history, so it's attempting to rectify that by confirming that Pocahontas really married John Rolfe. In all honesty, I don't know if trying to get Pocahontas and John Smith together, while it would be the easy way to appease fans of the romance, would be a degree of whitewashing history that would end up putting it on a level where it could be considered levels of widely insulting on par with, say, well, deciding that the Titanic was sunk by an evil whaler and his goons, and that the lives of the 1,500 plus Titanic passengers who died were instead saved by a giant octopus with a dog's nose. Or, if not quite there, maybe more on par with that Warner Brothers 1999 animated adaptation of Rodgers and Hammerstein's The King and I, which, for the record, has made my list of worst animated movies I have ever seen. Unfortunately, to make anything even remotely resembling a truly accurate or even respectful telling of Pocahontas' journey to England, one would have to undo the bulk majority or just ignore altogether the events of the first movie. Never mind how easily the biggest historical detail that the movie failed to get right was the fact that Pocahontas was both married to John Rolfe and a mother to a young child named Thomas when she arrives in England. And of course, the image at the end of the sequel of Pocahontas sharing a kiss with Rolfe as they sail back to Virginia is going to leave a sad taste in the mouths of people who already know what happened to her after she left England. So, the real problem with making a Pocahontas sequel right out of the get-go is deciding who it's even trying to appeal to. I know the easy answer would be, just don't make a Pocahontas sequel, but the problem with that answer is that it's too easy and practically doesn't fix anything. It's easy to second guess in hindsight, but really with filmmaking, as I have come to learn and try to remind people about, is that sometimes you don't really know when you've made a mistake until you already have made that mistake. So really, I'm here to approach this movie critiquing it from the perspective of an open-minded consumer who is not heavily biased towards one side or the other, a consumer who never expected the movie to be void of inaccuracies, but never believed that Disney had it in them to go that far with whitewashing history. So, with all that said, I've never been inherently against the idea of Pocahontas ending up with John Rolfe. Even as a kid, putting aside what I already knew to be accurate or not, there was a part of me that could appreciate filmmakers trying to teach a young audience that the first person you meet and fall in love with is not always your partner for life. I think most kids figure this out at a fairly young age, that their parents went through several relationships in their lives before finally settling and marrying, to say nothing of the sheer amount of kids who have step-parents, but that's another topic entirely. And don't give me the whole, oh, it's Disney, we shouldn't expect real life, we should just get what we want, because, frankly, that's a juvenile mindset, which I find to be a bigger insult to children's intelligence than any inaccuracy either of these films have to offer. For those of you who are still watching me right now after giving that hot take, the one thing about the departure of the romance of the first movie that I will concede to is that the sequel didn't need to be so freaking reductive towards the character of John Smith along the way. Between the start of the sequel and just before the third act, Smith is absent from the movie. And when he does get screen time, he just cracks a bunch of dumb puns whenever he outwits someone, and he and Rolfe bicker like a bunch of ninnies over whether or not Pocahontas should put herself in harm's way to stop Radcliffe's armada, while failing to notice her right in their presence before she runs out for her big third act self-realization, and then he and Pocahontas just break it off so abruptly. John gets appointed by the king to lead a whole fleet of ships to go exploring abroad, and he talks about glory and adventure and asks Pocahontas to join him, and then he says, "That's not what you want, is it?" And Pocahontas says, "We walked the same path once. I have found where I belong." Oh, well, I hope you find what you are looking for. One thing I do have to commend for the first movie is not going for the hearts and flowers ending where the romance between Pocahontas and Smith was resolved, but instead having her make the selfless decision to stay with her people while the two of them had to depart ways. So there is a part of me that can also concede that having already been through that in the first movie, we didn't need to do it again in the sequel. Even if John isn't trying to coerce her into going with him by the end of the sequel, it still feels kinda dickish for him to just be all of a sudden more interested in cruising the world and chasing glory and just up and be done with his brief relationship with her. The movie could have greatly benefited from taking the time to sit down at the end and have Smith acknowledge to Pocahontas that his heart is simply leading him in a different direction than hers, and that his heart's never specifically belonged in any one place, as he briefly alludes to the first movie when Pocahontas suggests that he could belong with her. So at the potential expense of sounding more schmaltzy than well written, I'd like to present some alternative dialogue to this scene. I've always just been drifting from place to place, chasing adventure and thrills. But meeting you has been the closest I've ever come to actually feeling like I belonged. And our love was one step between bringing peace between two worlds. But there are still many steps left. And you think that accepting the king's offer to go and explore the world is among those next steps? Honestly, yes I do. But if you must return home, then does that mean we need to part again? We never truly left each other, remember? I guess not. Wherever your heart leads you, John Smith, I will always carry you in mine. And I you. And I assure you that wherever I go, wherever peace needs to be brought to, I will never forget who taught it to me the best. Farewell, then. Anna, Pocahontas. Take care of her, Rolfe. Now I will move on to other details about the sequel, both the decent and less than decent, such as Pocahontas herself and what her journey in this movie is about. Here she goes on a journey to England in the next step between bringing peace between the Powhatan tribe and the English settlers currently living in Jamestown. I appreciate the fact that this movie acknowledges early on that despite Pocahontas successfully putting a halt to the fight that was about to brew in the climax of the first film, that didn't mean the complete end of prejudice and hostility. It was only that Chief Powhatan at the end of the first movie said, "If there is to be any more fighting, it will not begin with me." So with Pocahontas now having to go on to this new mission to settle the rising tension of King James getting the worst impression of the natives, I can definitely see the potential with this kind of story. It's an interesting idea, and even one that does live up to its potential at times and gives Pocahontas a believable arc. Such as the scene where she embarks off to England and has to look back when she leaves Virginia and her best friend Nakoma as the sort of avatar for the rest of the Powhatan tribe, whom she may never see again. And sadly does not, given what I mentioned earlier regarding those who know their history, and that goodbye scene is done pretty effectively in my opinion. Another example is the scene where Pocahontas is dressing up in proper English attire to attend the king's ball, and she has to remove her mother's necklace to make way for some more classic English jewelry. It's symbolic at how she is making a big sacrifice stepping away from her heritage on her journey where her ultimate purpose was to save them. And this arc comes full circle during the third act when she glances upon herself and reenacts Mulan and lets down her hair to daringly face the king as herself. Then there's the romance between her and John Rolfe. Honestly, I buy the development of their relationship fine in this movie for what it is. For anyone whose head is not shoved so far up their ass to stop watching me after I say I don't mind Pocahontas developing relationship with John Rolfe, let me proceed to explain why I buy it. It's not the greatest I've ever seen, but again, it's fine for what it is. Rolfe himself, he's not the most interesting character ever written, even when compared to Pocahontas and Smith, but I can't say I found anything especially hateable about him, apart from his moments of sexist demeanor, which in essence is the most accurate thing about the movie. Really, he's more than just a blank slate is what I'm saying. He is shown to frequently care for Pocahontas, he is the first to tip her off when he detects Radcliffe's schemes, and she puts her trust in him to teach her proper English etiquette, stringent as it is, so that she will make a good first impression on the king, and the two develop a fairly plausible bond. He's really just a worrywart who fears for any possibility of Pocahontas' free spirit leading her into danger until he ultimately sees through her eyes by the third act and supports her decision to face the king head-on in the climax, at which point he demonstrates more understanding of her than John Smith, which, yeah, I know is bound to make a bunch of fans salty. The camaraderie between the two Johns can be engaging at times, such as when they join forces to break Pocahontas out of prison. Of course, it would be more fun to watch if the movie wasn't so contingent on making the guards so easy to defeat. And of course, another one of the film's biggest crimes is how brain-dead stupid it makes Englishmen out to be in general. Like the scene where Smith charges in on horseback to stop Radcliffe's armada from sailing, and they go all, "Look out, it's the ghost of John Smith!" I mean, do the makers of this movie think that portraying English citizens like this is going to compensate for any offense committed against Native American descendants for their indigenous portrayals in the movie? That's not how it works! Moving on, Radcliffe returns as the main antagonist, never mind how the real figure was dead at this time. He has more of a prominence as a genuine threat who frequently appeals to King James's emotion and ignorance with false information that his reign as king is in jeopardy because of supposedly savage natives as manipulation to lead an armada on the New World. Some might disagree with me, but I think his motives and tactics here are an upgrade from the first movie, where he was just all, "They're just holding gold back from us, we must kill them to get it!" Plus, in this movie, he does devise easily the most truly diabolical, underhanded, villainous tactic that he has ever concocted to get the upper hand on Pocahontas. It involves a scene at the ball where he decides to entertain the king and guests with a bear baiting, which the writers seem to think involves just bringing forth a bear and jabbing at it with a bunch of sticks. Heads up, no, that is not what bear baiting is, so that's another point off for the accuracy scoreboard. When Pocahontas gets infuriated by this, she stands up against the king and his people, going so far as to say that they are the savage ones, and showing that even she's not immune to acting and speaking out of rage if provoked enough. And it ultimately shatters the good impression she was just making on the king and the Englanders, which ultimately gets her imprisoned. So, well played, Radcliffe. Unfortunately, the drawback is not only how overly dramatic and flamboyant Radcliffe is when he manipulates the king, in a nutshell giving off those obviously evil vibes that the king buys into because plot. There's the opening scene of the movie where he appears looming over John Smith, who is dangling from a third-story window after giving an Aladdin-style chase to the royal guard, and then he gloats, "The king believed my tales." And then he just nudges him off the windowsill into the river below, and in the next scene, he declares to the king that Smith is dead and he was too late to save him and all that. Two things here. Number one, if Radcliffe was an actually intelligent and competent villain, he would actually finish John Smith off himself in person, when he had the chance, and bring out his lifeless body for all England to witness and mourn over, so that there's far less chance of Smith coming back to foil his plan and expose him. That'd be much smarter than just assuming that Smith died just from falling a few stories into a river, especially since, this is number two, he was seen heroically jumping off the Susan Constine in the first movie during a raging storm to save his crewmates from drowning. There's villains not getting their hands dirty, and then there's not making sure the job is done. Even Scar and Hades would be facepalming at this because they at least had the excuse of mistakenly underestimating their henchman's reliability. I mean, it's not like Radcliffe had his kiss-ass manservant Wiggins back in this movie to do his dirty work for him. The songs, well, their biggest crime to me is not being especially memorable. But I can at least say that none of them made me want to mute the TV, which is more than I can say for other cheapquels I've seen. Judy Kuhn, returning to do the singing voice of Pocahontas, really does make it easy on the ears for some tunes that are otherwise mostly forgettable. The only two songs that I would say come close to being anything resembling bad would be the Welcome to London song, which comes off as a little show-tuney, to say nothing of how goofy the overall tone of the scene can get, and now there's a random cameo from William Shakespeare, who is also dead at this point in history, and Radcliffe's song, Things Are Not What They Appear, which is pretty ham-fisted with its message, and feels like it's trying too hard to be playing with the big boys from The Prince of Egypt. In short, Savages is easily the superior villain song, even with some of its on-the-nose lines such as, "They're not like you and me, which means they must be evil!" And lastly, there's a big tonal problem here, bigger than the first movie. In retrospect, it was probably for the best that Radcliffe didn't have Wiggins return at his side here, because this movie is already trying to juggle more stupid comic relief moments than it's really able to. Like, whenever the movie attempts to have a serious moment, it undercuts it with some feeble attempts at comic interlude from Miko the Raccoon, Percy the Pug, and Flit the Hummingbird, and other minor background characters. One such example who comes to mind is John Rolfe's housekeeper, who only exists to make blind jokes. I mean, as out of place as those comic relief moments in the first movie could easily be, they did at least succeed in being funny. Being brutally honest here for a moment, I can't say I laughed once during any of Miko's, Percy's, or Flit's comic antics in this movie. Those moments just come off as being spastic slapstick just for the sake of it, without any understanding of the concept of build-up and payoff that makes comedy really work. It feels very much like most slapstick you'd see in many lower-tier quality cartoons aimed at kids in the 90s. As beaten into the ground as this saying is, I still think it bears repeating so that the mentality remains, you don't need to dumb everything down just because it's a kids' movie. I will say that this movie did have me laughing at a few points, namely from Utamata Makin, the silent, nonchalant, glowering bodyguard whom Chief Powhatan assigns with Pocahontas to mark off how many potential enemies there are in the New World. I can see how this guy can come off as a racist stereotype, but honestly, he's the one responsible for any real funny moments I can remember in this whole movie. Though he doesn't return with Pocahontas by the end of the movie to fill Powhatan in on how many threats they would have to face from England for some reason. I guess they just decided that all bets are off and they no longer have to worry about any more threats from the New World. Whatever. To conclude, the ultimate reason that Pocahontas 2 has gotten the backlash it has, I feel, is because the breakup between Pocahontas and John Smith is too abrupt, the historically accurate excuse falls through with the abundance of inaccuracies elsewhere, and the overall quality of the end product isn't high enough to justify it. But honestly, it doesn't feel to me like a minimal effort cash grab either. Not entirely, anyways. It might not even really be the highest candidate for being a Disney cash grab in any case, especially with the original not being their best received film, however lucrative and receptive to merchandising it might have been. I can see certain reasons why this particular direct-to-video sequel would be offensive to some, including indigenous groups, and also considered to be the most embarrassing to the company, but to me, it's just a forgettable mess more than anything. There's a lot of things about it that don't work. There are a few things that I'll have the balls to say that I think did work, but ultimately, it just evens out to being on the bad end of mediocre. Worse than a lot of other selections, to be sure, but certainly not as low quality as others I have seen. And again, I do not say that just because I don't have an especially strong attachment to the original, because that one is still by far the superior one. If you really need a fix of a Pocahontas follow-up, there are a few sequel spin-off read-along books available to your kids, one of which my sister and I had when we were little, which tied more into the season of Thanksgiving. All of them are pretty much entirely detached from history and exist totally in the fictional universe of the Disney canon, and if you're able to accept that, the stories are pretty much okay for what they are. Or you can watch her in the scenes with Vanellope and the other Disney princesses in Ralph Breaks the Internet. If you're looking for Disney to do portrayals of indigenous cultures true justice, you have Moana, and even more recently, Raya and the Last Dragon, despite whatever nonsense Lizzie Ellis recently posted on Twitter that got her into some deep, deep controversy which she has not handled well. Raya might not be among my favorites from Disney's canon, and it's not perfect, but I think it was a rare example of one that overall lived up to the levels of hype that the trailers were building around it. And I'm really happy to see that it's been generally well received by audiences of the culture that it's representing. And it does a great job with the war between world cultures plot to boot. Of course, as many have pointed out, the premise is easily comparable to Avatar: The Last Airbender, but hey, it makes sense to turn to the best for inspiration, so there's no reason why they can't both be praised. Also, I just recently went to catch a Dolby Digital screening at my local theater for only $15, half of what I would get to watch it on Disney+. And that's pretty much all I have to say for this video. Take care, and I will eventually give you an update about what else I've got going on in my life and what I plan to talk about next time.